just a minute, she's not going.
Okay. Thursday, my week started going south. I have a weather station. The weather temperature said my weather station said the temperature was 99.6. The heat index was 117. I said, boy, I sure hope my air conditioner keeps on going. This is putting a real workout on it. Yesterday, it quit. It's a new unit. It's only 5 years old. A humongous Train unit. It's the second time. It gave up a evaporator coil not too long ago. Well, back in April it was. So things are not going real well today. Okay, this morning I'm going to conclude my series on understanding the Bible. We will again use Romans chapter 3, verses 21 through 28. We will focus on reconcile or reconciliation and sanctify or sanctification. Most everyone will agree. I'm going to read part of what I did a couple of weeks ago. This is the last time I'll read it for a while. Most everyone will agree, understanding that everything you read requires a good vocabulary and understanding the meanings of the words. The Bible uses many terms that are not in common use today and requires a little work on our part. We are to read and study to get the understanding that the writer intended. In Romans chapter 3, starting in verse 21. But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. Even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ, unto all and upon all them that believe, for there is no difference. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Verse 24, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God has set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past through the forbearance of God. To declare, I say at this time, his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of him which believe in Jesus. Where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? Nay, but by the law of faith. Verse 28. Therefore we conclude that man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. Apart from the words used in Romans chapter 3, verses 21 through 28, clarifying the gospel message for today, we find the term reconcile in Romans chapter 5, verse 10. Reconcile means to restore to friendship or fellowship. Reconciliation, then, is a state or condition of having been reconciled. And you probably noticed that the reconcile or reconciliation is not included in Romans chapter 3, verses 21 through 28. You will, however, find it in Romans 5, verse 10. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, being reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. This is actually the theme of God's message for man today. Mankind, because of his sin and rebellion against God, has been cut off from any relationship with God. This is what we mean when we say man is a poor sinner, poor lost sinner. In fact, he was more than that. As a result of man's rebellion against God, he has become an enemy of God. Verse 10 again, for if when we were enemies. We speak of the work of reconciliation on behalf of all mankind. We are speaking of something unique in this present age. The book of Genesis, from chapters 1 through 11, nations were formed. These were the Gentiles. As a whole, the Gentiles turned from God in their rebellion, and God cut them off from himself. From Genesis 12 all the way through the balance of the Old Testament and into the New Testament, until midway through the book of Acts, God has created and chosen to deal with the nation Israel, one nation, Israel. During this time, Gentiles were God's enemies. Nation Israel were his people. But they too rebelled against God when they failed to receive all that God had promised them through the prophets. When this happened, God did something no prophet ever predicted. God cut off Israel for a time from being his people. In Romans 11, verses 28 through 32 reveals God's purpose in this. In writing to the Gentiles, Paul says, "As concerning the gospel, they," meaning Israel, "are enemies for your sakes." Verse 32, "For God has concluded them in all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all." The final term we'll look at is sanctification, which means the state or condition of having been separated from or set apart as holy unto God. The term sanctification in a term that designates, the term sanctification in that term designates ownership. A person, place, or thing is separated from its prior owner and becomes the possession of its new owner. Also, in the process of transferring the ownership, there is the cleansing. Since the new owner is God, the person, place, or thing must be consecrated or made holy. The Bible speaks of sanctification of persons, places, days, seasons, objects, the firstborn of Israel, the Levites, the priests, the altar, the offerings, and the Sabbath, and so on. All of these were set apart unto God. They were his. The emphasis of this definition is not the Old Testament sanctification of things, but the New Testament sanctification of the believer. The moment a person puts his trust in the finished work of Jesus Christ, he is sanctified. The cross is a means of cleansing and purifying the believer from his sins, and by it he is sanctified. Notice in the following verse, the believer has already been sanctified. If you look at Hebrews chapter 10, verse 10, "By the which will we are sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ, once for all." We as believers belong to God now. Therefore, we ought to live for him today and every day that the Lord gives us. Finally, the time will come when the Lord shall give a shout, and we will be caught up in the air with the Lord. This will be our final sanctification. We will once and for all be set apart from this world, and so ever shall we be with the Lord. That concludes my thought for the week.